Good morning. Welcome to the Atlanta Council. Thank you for coming to today's Captains of Industry event, which we've entitled The Modern Government Services Company, Innovating Solutions for Public Challenges. I'm Steve Grundman. I'm a senior fellow in the Scowcroft Center of the Atlanta Council, and I'm also the producer of Captains of Industry. Captains of Industry is a series which convenes senior executives in business to address the public interests their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. As befits the title of this series, this one features two such captains, Tina Dolph, the president and CEO of Siemens Government Technologies, which you may hear us refer to as SGT. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you. Good morning.
And Rob Seuss, the president and CEO of Applied Research Associates, which you may hear us refer to as ARA. Welcome, Rob.
Good morning.
Thanks to both of you for coming. So the purpose of our discussion is going to be to unpack what, for me, is the often surprising and certainly always interesting range of things that are going on in the government services marketplace. It's a sector which has quadrupled in size over the past quarter century in response to the government's demand for a quite now wide range of technical, professional, and operational capabilities. It's also a sector, many of you watching will know, that is experiencing a fairly unprecedented restructuring by mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, many of them financed by private equity capital. We'll have some discussion about that phenomenon as well. In general, Tina and Rob will share their observations on these and other developments from their perspectives in their respective companies. That discussion among the three of us is going to form the centerpiece of today's event. Ahead of it, though, I have prevailed upon my friend Dave Berteau, the president of the Professional Services Council, to offer some framing remarks. The other bookend of our discussion is going to be Q&A. Certainly our agenda makes time in the last 20 or 25 minutes of it for us to take questions from those of you watching here in this live stream. You can offer us those questions using the Q&A tab on your Zoom down at the bottom. Most of you will be a year into the pandemic, probably savvy enough to know how to do this, but I'll reiterate that you'll take written questions over the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. My friend Byron Callan from Capital Alpha Partners, individual member of the Atlanta Council. Byron will curate the questions and then voice them to us on your behalves when we get to that part of the program. We strongly encourage the event will be all that much better if we can get some great questions from those of you who are watching. Before I turn to Dave, just a couple of other housekeeping notes. The first of which is that this event is entirely public and on the record. The consequence of that, of course, is greatest for Rob and Tina, but also for those of you who may want to ask questions. Please include your name and affiliation in your typed out questions for Byron. And then lastly, to know that we are tweeting the event over the hashtag Forward Defense. So Forward Defense is the practice area within the Scowcroft Center where my fellowship resides. Its mission is to bring to light forward-looking analyses of the trends, technologies, and concepts that will define the future of defense. So again, we'll be tweeting over the hashtag Forward Defense. All right, all of those preliminaries now complete. I want to welcome Dave Berteau, who's going to frame our conversation with some remarks of his own. Dave has enjoyed a distinguished career with stops in, among other places, the Department of Defense, where he once served as the Assistant Secretary for Logistics and Material Readiness. Dave also has made stops at the think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, the University of Texas. There he is, Syracuse University. And I'm pleased to mention he's also currently a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration. Dave, thank you very much for joining us and getting this conversation kicked off with your framing remarks.
Good morning, and thank you, Steve. That's a very gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. It's a real pleasure for me to join you and your guests this morning, because the three of you are going to help illuminate what I think is a very underappreciated part of the ability of the federal government to do its work. And that part, of course, is the technology and professional services industry. As the CEO of PSC, I'm very proud to represent hundreds of companies, all sizes, all structures, who deliver services every day in support of federal government missions and functions across all agencies. And you're going to hear from two of those companies today. Let me open up with some facts. Government data on contract obligations, you're very familiar with this, Steve, makes a distinction between contracts for products and services. And what those data show is that 60% of contract obligations in fiscal year 2020, which is the last full year of data, were for what the government characterized as services. And that percentage has been roughly the same for the past 5 years. I'll talk about what's under that percentage in a minute. Let's look just at the Defense Department. Now, DoD obligates 4 times as much for products as the rest of the government combined. Think of ships and planes and tanks. But even so, more than 50% of the $450 billion that DoD spends on contracts is for services. That's a big market. That market has grown 37% government-wide since FY16, and it's grown 44% in DoD, and that's just the market for services contracts. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Technology development and innovation across the board are leading to changes in the nature of what the government buys under contract. The result is that much of what we once bought as a product now can be procured as a service. Even the spacesuits worn on the International Space Station are part of a service contract, along with the launch, the delivery vehicle, and the safe return of the astronauts. And software may still be listed by the government as a product, but when's the last time you held it in your hand on a floppy disk? These are now services. Government acquisition and procurement practices, however, have not kept up with the changing nature of services. And I think that's something that both of your guests here will comment on this morning as they try to do their business. Too often, federal procurement looks at services as a drive to the lowest price, regardless of the results. In practice, of course, it's not always easy for a procuring contracting officer to write the memo that says, I went with the higher bidder for the following reasons. Sometimes it's hard to fill in the blank of what those reasons are. Too often also, the process focuses on the number of people, their labor categories, their education level, their years of experience. The government is really just buying input, not outcomes. If I'm procuring data storage and analysis, I shouldn't really care how many personnel, how many full-time equivalents or FTEs are being used in that work. I should care whether I get the data and the analysis I need when I need it. The procurement process often aims at labor categories and labor hours more than results. Too often, the government doesn't specify those results, the results that it desires. And even when it can do that, set clear requirements and measures for results and outcomes, the government has difficulty turning those outcome-based requirements into solicitations, into evaluation criteria, into source selection, and into contract performance. It doesn't have to be that way, and sometimes it's not. One of our jobs as a trade association is to help the government be a smarter customer, better able to know what it needs and to define those needs as outcomes and results, and a better buyer, better able to contract to meet those needs. There's a story. I once bid on a contract that had a requirement for clean rooms, and the solicitation didn't tell me how clean the room had to be. It told me how many times a day I needed to sweep the floor. That's the difference between input and outcomes. What does that mean? It means that companies who are undertaking to bring the advantages to the government of technology and innovation in services face twin challenges. First, making the technology work to meet the government's needs, and second, finding a way to get it under contract. There's also a third challenge, and I suspect you'll hear about this from both of your guests here this morning, Steve, and that's workforce. Across our member companies, there's a shortage of skilled talent, key personnel, trusted and cleared personnel. Thousands, often tens of thousands of funded positions are vacant. That means work that's not being done or not being done as well or fast as it should be. Unemployment may be too high across America, but in the government services contracting business, it's a tight market, and that's a third challenge. There's also 3 broader uncertainties that shape the federal market for services contractors. You'll probably touch on all these in the questions, if not during the presentations. One is the budget. We're more than halfway through fiscal year 21. We're 5.5 months from the start of the next fiscal year, but we're not nearly halfway through getting to the budget agreement for that October 1st deadline. We're working on a most unusual budget process. Very late start, the latest submission ever. No agreement in the Congress or between the Congress and the White House on the floor or the ceiling of how much spending, either across the board or for defense, and less time than usual. We have a summary released last Friday from OMB, of $1.5 trillion for discretionary appropriations, that is both defense and non-defense agencies. But it doesn't add up to the total. The details don't add up to the total. So we don't know what's missing and we don't know when we're going to see it. It's hard for the budget committees to start marking up a budget resolution. We have the possibility that Congress and the administration might amend the fiscal year 21 budget resolution, the one they used for the COVID relief bill in March, to reuse its reconciliation authority for another purpose. But that means they can't start on the FY22 budget resolution until they're completely done with the FY21 resolution. And of course, within DoD, we have a still evolving DoD budget and the expectation of a detailed president's budget proposal, quote, later this spring, end quote. More importantly, but less attention, we have a debt ceiling resetting on August 1st. It's largely being ignored, perhaps on the assumption that the Treasury Department's extraordinary measures will buy enough time that we don't have to deal with it all that soon. But how much time can Treasury buy when monthly deficits are in the hundreds of billions of dollars? Just reported $660 billion for March, although that will go down by the time we get to August. So time is short, pressure is high. The second broad uncertainty is leadership, due in part to the late start of the presidential transition, in part to self-imposed constraints, and in part to the sacrifices that we demand of people who want to come into these positions. The Biden administration is behind in filling Senate confirmed positions. Decisions by interim officials take longer, feel less certain than those by nominated confirmed personnel. I know, I've done that 3 times. The third broad issue is the broader dynamics of the erosion of a trust in government, coupled with rising threats ranging from geopolitical threats, cybersecurity, to issues of diversity and inclusion and social justice. And the uncertainties are here, obviously beyond the scope of this morning's remarks, but they affect everything in our services industry. And I want to close on this point. It's my considered view that the performance of services contractors can actually play a significant, if undervalued, role in improving the performance of the federal government. And by doing so, companies such as the ones from which you're about to hear will be doing more than their part to help restore trust and confidence in government. And that may actually be the greatest contribution that the services industry makes. With that, Steve, I want to thank you for providing me with the opportunity to open this morning's conversation, and I'll turn the mic back over to you. Over.
Okay, Dave, thank you very, very much. That does exactly what we had hoped for and what gets us off to a good start. Frames up many of the issues that we're going to want to discuss here this morning. My guests know what my agenda is, but let me just outline it for the audience. We're going to talk in roughly 15 or 20-minute segments across 3 broad topics, and then take your questions and put a wrap on this before the top of the hour, which on the East Coast is 11 o'clock. The 3 parts that we're going to organize our conversation around is themselves and their companies. Neither of them would have their feelings hurt if I said ARA and SGT are not the most well-known of the companies in this sector. And so I want to take some time, both because it's interesting, but also to give the audience a good grounding in who you are and what your companies do. That'll be section 1. Section 2 is we'll take up many of the topics that Dave has outlined, talk about the market, about the customer, about how tastes and preferences of the customer's needs are changing, and about the competitive landscape, the things that I referenced in my remarks. And then finally, in the third segment of our discussion, I want to talk about drivers of change, look ahead into the future, beyond the changes that we're trying to take account of and respond to now. What's next? What do you as chief executives do or want to do? What are you thinking about beyond the immediate fight, so to speak? And at that point, at maybe around half past the next hour, or between then and 20 minutes of 11, we'll start taking questions from the audience, at which point I'll prevail upon Byron to offer us some of these. Okay, so let's get to it. Finally, hear the voices of Tina and Rob. I'll start with Tina with that basic question. Tell us about Siemens Government Technologies, and maybe weave in a point that picks up from the last thing Dave said and references this mission statement that I made a reference to. What are the public interests your company serve?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Atlantic Council and to PSC for hosting these sessions. I think, I often listen to these kind of conversations, because I think that's how our service industry grows and gets more intelligent about the issues we're facing. So I'm really happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. As Steve said, Siemens Government Technologies may not be the best well known, but I will tell you that Siemens, our parent company, is very well known. So let me explain a little bit about what SGT is and what we do. So SGT is the separate but affiliated part of Siemens that is responsible for providing cleared services and sensitive services to the government. So as a foreign company, there are certain regulations that the US federal government puts on us around security and information to ensure that we keep our nation's assets safe. So my company is we're fully affiliated and owned by Siemens, but we have our own board of directors. And our mission really is to bring to the market the full power of what this amazing technology powerhouse company has. Siemens has been around for 170 plus years, really at the forefront of every industrial revolution that has gone through over the last number of decades, and really has a ton to bring to this market. So what we SGT try to do is figure out all of the good things that Siemens has. How does that satisfy the customer and the mission requirements that we see in this market space? Our mission, as we define it, is to secure and modernize the most intricate and strong infrastructure in the world, which is the federal government. Right. And you think about all of the opportunities that present there. There's many days where me and my team struggle with, where do we start? Siemens is known for many of its technological prowess, as you'd say, primarily in smart infrastructure, where we bring together energy sources and buildings and people to figure out how do we provide energy resilient solutions to our clients. And if you think about what's happening in the federal space, we've got this infrastructure that is circa 1940s at best. And it's a little overwhelming when you think about how do we get that to be prepared for the next fight. And when you talk to senior, officials in the services, that's, top of mind. So we bring together energy efficiencies with, energy savings performance contracts. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of that a little bit later. So we'll talk a little bit there. And then we also have another side of our business, which is really the most exciting part right now, is this digital transformation that I think we're all going to talk about this morning. Siemens is one of the top 10 providers of software in the world. They bring digital modeling and engineering and digital twins to really improve everything from, producing, automobiles to laying out infrastructures of different cities and so forth. So when you think about that as it applies to the federal government, think about bases and shipyards and all of the infrastructure that our military needs to be successful. We really are a partner with them to bring together digital transformation into how do they become more resilient and efficient. So to say that we are busy would be an understatement. And as we relate to this topic, we really are kind of a blend of a product company who, as Dave mentioned in his comments, is really starting to provide our solutions via services contracts, more so than we have in the past. And I'm really looking forward to talking and exploring what we see in the market space as we go forward. So maybe with that, I'll stop there and we'll let Rob
that's the perfect start.
Perfect.
Rob, same question. Tell us about ARA.
Quite a bit different because we are a pure services company trying to do products, eventually kind of leverage. So almost the opposite or reverse. So easiest way to talk about ARA is to talk about, since we're at our core, we're services, our employees. So we're 1,400 people. But the vast majority of our people have advanced technical degrees. We're scientists and engineers. And so for that, we serve the customers we serve tend to be in primarily national security. About 75% of our business is national security. We also serve other government customers, civilian agencies, Department of Transportation, federal highways. So but within national security, we primarily serve the R&D agencies. So within the broad spectrum of Department of Defense, our largest customer is Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the R&D part of DTRA. We also serve the Army and the Air Force research laboratories are also big customers of ours. So a little bit different. We're core services. Our people have advanced degrees, and that's what we like to do. In terms of, let's say, serving the public interest, I can give a lot of examples later, but you asked about the public interest. It brings to mind So we're always trying to solve the tough problems that the government is interested in. So we're almost always serving the public interest.
Sure. It wasn't supposed to be a hard question.
But it's an easy one. So it's a softball. But the most recent one is we actually got very much involved in solving challenges of the pandemic. So, and it's really great for me to be able to speak about that. So when we've actually been working for several years for an agency called BARDA, which is part of Department of Health and Human Services. They, BARDA, for several years, we've been working with BARDA on how do you solve this potential problem to them back then of a shortage of personal protection equipment during a pandemic, in particular, the N95 respirators that, we see healthcare workers and of course wearing, and of course during the pandemic, there's a huge shortage of PPE. So what ARA had been tasked to do by BARDA was to come up with a way to make a respirator that's reusable. You can use it over and over thousands of times and thereby solve the potential shortage that we saw several years ago. And of course it happened and it hit. Unfortunately, we were right in the middle of developing designs when the pandemic hit. And thanks to our customer, and we made some internal investments, we accelerated what would have been a 2 to 3 year process into a year. We went from designs to prototypes, to user testing, to design for manufacturing. And through the somewhat lengthy and a little bit frustrating, but lengthy, and we understand for good reason, the government certification process, which we've been working on since early winter. And we should have something out on the market in the next month. So maybe a little late for this pandemic, but we'll be prepared for the next one. So that's an example of the kind of things. Maybe give one more example on the pandemic since it's relevant. So our big customer is DITRA. So for DITRA, we also do a lot of advanced computer modeling and simulation. That's actually our core capability with complex models. So during the pandemic, we were asked to model disease transmission. In particular, a DoD mission was we had pilots transporting COVID patients, troops that were deployed and had come down with COVID and needed to be transported to hospitals. So how do you model the potential for disease transmission on the aircraft and protect the pilots? So we modeled how the disease might transmit and then come up with mitigation measures. So another example of how we serve the public interest.
I mean, part of the reason I wanted to start the conversation this way is that for better and worse, and there's nothing wrong with it, but I think the conventional wisdom about what a government services company is fits a couple of different molds. One is IT services. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And the other is SETA, Systems Engineering Technical Assistance, sort of working side by side with the government, even in some ways performing maybe by a degree different government functions. And so one of the reasons I wanted each of you to come here and talk concretely about what you do is to illustrate hardly the full range of other things that comprise government services, but the kinds of things, those modeling and even designing products. Tina, what's an example from your business to kind of, again, fill out the imagination of what a government services contractor does?
Yeah, there's so many to pick from. I would say what's interesting to me is I've been in the service market my whole career, right? So I got in, and we can talk, I know that's a question we'll talk about a little bit later, but I've seen the government use services from everything to build base camps in Africa with the State Department to solving some of the most complex, computing challenges of NASA, right? So what's exciting about this market is all the different opportunities we have. One of the things we're doing right now with Siemens, which is kind of a blend of a services contract. So we're bringing through a product, but we are right now in the process of modernizing with the Navy all of their shipyards. So they have a program called the SIOP program, Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program, where essentially what the Navy's trying to figure out is how do they look at their current infrastructure, map it out, and figure out what are the best investments to make in the shipyard so they can keep the ships deployed, right? And you think about it, the more ship is at sea and not in dry dock, that is better for the Navy. It's better for all of us as they keep us safe, right? So our products, we actually go in, and it's kind of a really cool process, right? Because we will go in and, like I mentioned earlier, the infrastructure is, circa 1945, right? So we've got old machinery that doesn't talk to each other. We have human beings in the process, right? So we have to figure out if a sailor is fixing a piece of a ship, what does his day look like? If he shows up on the shipyard, and where's he go? So we map all of that. We talk to the human beings, we talk to the machines, and we fundamentally digitally map that whole process. And I was joking with the panelist earlier this morning. I am not an engineer or a technician. I am a finance person. That's how I grew up. So a lot of this was lost on me, but essentially what we're able to do is create this full digital model that when you look at it, it's really almost like looking at a video game, right? And my engineers always kind of scrunch their noses when I say that, but it really is. When we're done, we can literally pick up buildings and move it to another part of the shipyard. And when we do that, all of the foot traffic changes and maps. So it's really a living, breathing model that we can provide to our clients. And that's just one example. We do similar things in all sorts of different agencies, but what that allows, and part of that is services, right? How many hours is it, to David's comment earlier about hours, we tried to focus on what is the output and what is the deliverable that we have for the Navy. And we're using kind of a blend of a product contract and a service contract to execute that whole kind of soup to nuts of the digital model at the shipyards. And it's really kind of, having been in this industry a long, long time, it's exciting to see the physical world and the technical world and the digital world really start to map and deliver all of what we knew it could, right? And I think to your point, Rob, about the pandemic, that has kind of moved us along a little faster than it would have, right? Because in the past, it was nice to, we knew we had this capability, and it was nice to have. What the pandemic showed, I think all of us, is that it is important to have it now and quickly, right? And we're proof pointing that. And now we're seeing in these digital models where we thought we could get 10-15% efficiencies, we're seeing upwards 25-30. If you think about a $715 billion budget, a 20% efficiency is pretty impressive. So we're pretty excited to be able to continue to do that with them. It's exciting
example. Let's come back to how you have contracted with the government for maybe even these very examples. Picking up some of the points that Dave was making in the second segment. But one of the traditions, if I may call it that, of this Captains of Industry series is to get to know the captain of industry. And so I'm interested in, why don't we just toggle back to Rob first in how did you come to this job, or how did you get into it? You could have done a lot of things in life, but here you are, the CEO of ARA.
So different. I am an engineer. I have a PhD in engineering. I started out, my PhD work was in something called computational mechanics, but how do you understand uncertainties and complex models? And back then I was working on earthquake prediction models and damage to buildings. So a more modern, that's still modern, but a more current and relevant example is a complex computer model like a climate model or a disease transition model. So my expertise was always, how do you understand, you can make a prediction with those models, but how do you tell what are the uncertainty bounds on those predictions? And decision makers need to understand the range of uncertainties. So I was doing that work for a company in California. We were working on earthquake analysis, and that company had, we're doing some joint work actually for ARA's largest customer, Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Their predecessor, we were working on a joint project, and that was a little bit different. That was related to blast effects on deep underground tunnels for, in those days, nuclear weapon effects.
Right. And
I learned about ARA doing in that work, and the company I was working for was having some difficulties, I would say, at the time. But ARA had all of these complex modeling projects they were working on. And so for me, it was purely technical, the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. ARA had a lot of it. So I sent in an application to ARA, and I got the job. So I started out as an engineer. Through my career, I was, eventually they asked me to run the office in the divisional office in North Carolina. And then later I got promoted to this job in the early 2000s. I moved here to the DC area. And I have to say, I never aspired to be the CEO of ARA. I was really happy doing technical work, and the founders of the company and also the fellow who was my boss thought I could do a good job at it. And let other people judge whether they were right or wrong about that.
You made
but
the
they
leap.
tapped me for the job, and I love, it's a great job. Sometimes I miss doing the technical work, but we'll talk about it more. We'll have opportunities to talk. We do so many cool things at ARA. I just love seeing what we do and helping people do that. And I still have plenty of opportunity to dig in to interesting things and help
Yeah.
sell new technologies. So
Your the pivot you describe from the one company to ARA reminds me, again, we're building an agenda for later in
Yeah.
the conversation of how just the attractiveness of the work
well,
is
exactly.
often money counts, but the attractiveness of the
Well,
work.
I took a 10% pay cut to come work for ARA. So,
Well,
yeah.
sometimes it's
And
inversely
the founders of the
counting.
company would always like to remind people about that.
No, actually, I'm sorry, you're making the very point I'm aiming for, which is that the attractiveness of the challenge is a big impetus to recruitment in this industry, probably in most industries, but money doesn't always win the day for technical staff in particular. Tina, where'd you come from? How'd you get into this business?
Yeah, well, like Rob, if you had told me, younger me, that I would have this job at some point, I would have told you were nuts, right? And it was never like, I wasn't one of those people like, I want to be a CEO someday. But I got into this industry almost by accident because I came out of school in the early 90s and had a marketing degree and really thought I was going to be the next big thing on Wall Street and New York City and the advertising world. That was my goal, right?
Madison Avenue.
Madison Avenue, here I come, right? Turns out Madison Avenue, when you come out of college in New York City, back then doesn't pay anything, like not even enough to live on, right? So big reality check at the, and I went to a small school in Syracuse, and right down the road, General Electric Aerospace had a large plant and they were recruiting for their financial management program. So I literally went into that with, all right, I'll do this for 6 months until I can get my real
just
job.
To tide me
just
over.
to tide me over, right? And I had this amazing experience, right? Like that program was fantastic because it was a rotational program that you got to try a bunch of different jobs over a 2-year period. So I learned very quickly. I'm a very good program finance person. I learned very quickly. I am a horrible accountant. But I learned all that early on. And most what I learned is I really got to partner with the government client for the first time. So at that time we were doing radar services, right? So GE Aerospace, built these radars, and then I was in the services piece where we were responsible for the contracts. And that doesn't sound very exciting often when you talk about it until you understand what these radars do and how important it was if one went down, right? So I quickly became very educated about the importance of this mission, right? And I've never served in the military. I always often say I was never brave enough, but my grandfather did, and my father spent his careers, as a contractor, but working for the naval nuclear program. So it was kind of embedded in my DNA, this idea of serving the government. And once you start to see the mission, I got hooked, right? So then, and it was an interesting career ride, right? Because the services industry has always seen a lot of change and churn, right? So we say now, oh, there's a lot of M&A going. I would argue that's been happening for the last 26 years, right? Because I think my first 4 years of my career, I changed companies 3 times and never left my desk.
Indeed, I think that company that you're referring to is now a Lockheed Martin
Yes,
company,
so
right?
General Electric Aerospace sold its division 6 months after I started, sold it to merged, I guess maybe is the right answer, with Martin Marietta.
Right.
So a company out of California, which I had never heard of, right? So I remember very clearly people being the GEers in the building who had been there for 30 years. I mean, you got a GE meatball tattoo when you started, right? People crying in the hallways, which I didn't understand as a 22-year-old kid. I didn't get that, right? But I'm like, it's a job. Like, what's the big deal? But now I clearly understand that. And then, shortly after Martin Marietta merged, then Lockheed and Martin Marietta merged to make Lockheed Martin, right? So then I spent plenty of my time with Lockheed. And what was nice about this industry is it provided me an opportunity to see a whole bunch of different service models, right? Everything from IT services to, I too spent time at the Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory as a financial analyst, where we got to serve the nuclear Navy. And if you want a lesson in mission and importance, that's a really good place to spend some time. And then you came down here and with Lockheed, I moved out of the upstate New York area and moved down here into the Washington, D.C. area, where I've had the opportunity to do IT services and do all sorts of different M&A activities. So I really got hooked on this mission. So then you kind of look back, I don't know, I think this happened to you, Rob, but you ever look back every now and then, you're like, how did I get here? Like,
how did that happen?
How did that happen? Like, this isn't New York, right? But I was so entrenched by the mission, and the industry offered me so many different opportunities. Lockheed at one point, probably a really exciting part of my journey was Lockheed bought a company called PAE. And PAE is a services company, right? Very different services than I had ever been part of. And
building things in Africa.
Building things in Africa, training police forces around the world for State Department through their CivPol contract contract. So we bought that, and I was at a point in my career which I was in that the M&A area, really from the transition perspective, right? The piece of the company that bought PAE then needed transition, and what a learning experience, because you could not have bought a company that was more different than Lockheed Martin, right? So like even myself, like I didn't know where I'm embarrassed to admit this, but like I didn't know where Djibouti, Africa was, right? Like I don't, you know, then 6 months later found myself there, you know. So but it really showed you the full breadth of what the government buys using these service models, right? And then when you see what the State Department, what their mission is and what they do, again, another really injection of, hey, this is really important work, right? I think sometimes people think about, like my friends will say, oh, you're in the defense industry, right? And I'm like, but it is the coolest industry. Like there is so much opportunity here to really make a difference. So once, you know, we Lockheed Martin then sold a PAE, and I made probably the hardest decision of my career, because I was given a choice. Do I stay at Lockheed, where that had been my home for 20 some odd years, or do I go with this company, which we didn't know what was going to happen. Like it could have been bought by a strategic, it could have been bought by private equity. I could have been fired the day after that transaction. That all happens, right? But the mission was so exciting. I was like, I'm going to stay. What a great ride that was, because we ended up being purchased by a private equity owner. That was my first experience in private equity ownership. Some really great things around. I think that's that part of the market serves things I learned that I didn't know. And really then got convinced that, you know, there's real value here. And did that for a couple more years, and then, you know, moved on to a few more jobs. And then I was sitting, and I got a call from Siemens, you know, to get recruited to this position. And at first I was like, Siemens, like, really, what do they do in the marketplace? You know, what do they, I just didn't know. And then you start researching it, right? And you see the amazing technology this company has. And then I start piecing together all the pieces of, hey, I know from my past experience that if I had this product and that technology, I could really provide some service here. So then that was a really easy decision, right? And now I am really blessed to work with some of the best, you know, technical minds on the planet, to really put together these kind of world-class solutions. So, you know, I wake up every morning, you know, very kind of thankful that I got this position. And like Rob said, you know, I really, really enjoy it. And I think the best part of it is really helping the people not only satisfy this mission, this all important mission that's driven me through my career, but watching them kind of grow and develop and be able to provide these kind of services to something that's really important to my heart has just been a really interesting ride. So didn't expect I ever be sitting in this chair, but glad, they're very happy to be here and consider myself blessed.
Well, good. I mean, that's exactly that trajectory in each of your careers, not least because they are different, started differently anyway. Is exactly what I wanted to draw out for the audience. Let's go ahead and start the second chapter of our discussion, talk about the market, both the supply and demand side of it, but maybe work straight off of Dave's agenda among the customers. So Dave emphasized, for example, the difficulty, but also evolution of the customers, what I call tastes and preferences for buying services as inputs, as outputs, and maybe as outcomes. Maybe the way to frame this up and get it going is, Rob, where do you see the government's progress toward being able to buy services more, I suppose, efficiently, both from their own perspective as well as from the perspective of the suppliers? We're in some kind of a transition. Where's your barometer needle on that transition?
Oh boy. I don't know. I don't want to be too negative.
Of course not. Of course not. But at the same time,
I can't say, you know, there have been some improvements over I've been doing services for 30 years. So the last 10 or 15 years have been very challenging, I would say. And there's been some improvement with, like we do a lot of OTAs, other transaction agreements now has become very popular. So, but those kind of things have tended to get slow as well. I'm not sure that's what you wanted me to say.
No, I want to know what's going on out
there. So it's still very challenging. There's very long delays in acquisition. Dave alluded to that. We have a lot of contract vehicles, a lot of IDIQ vehicles. So our customers can get to us that way. With our major customers, we have contract vehicles but even task orders within those contract vehicles take a long time.
But
So
are they typically metered on an input basis like these IDIQs, number of
so
labor hours?
it's more kind of like what Dave said. I mean, our customers tend to want to buy FTEs, right?
Okay.
They don't always specify FTEs, and there'll be a work scope, but really what they want to do is they want to buy FTEs. But we have had some projects. We see more fixed price projects now where they are looking for outcomes. They say, okay, we want a piece of software at the end of it. We want a robotic vehicle, all to be turnkey and delivered, a prototype, say, to be delivered at the end of it.
What about
So-
the example, if I may interrupt you, of the mask? How
Yeah.
was that contracted for?
Yeah, so the mask was a design that we came up with in response to a problem. So there, in that case, I believe that was a fixed price contract, but I'd have to check. But they were, in that case, I think Berto was very forward thinking, and they were very much outcome oriented.
Right.
So they said, do the research and development and come up with something. We proposed something, and they wanted a testable prototype out at the end. So that was very much metered, not so much by labor hours as outcome.
Okay.
We have some customers that are very forward thinking that way, and we've seen some projects and programs that way.
Still, Rob, I'm hearing your reply to be, I won't say it in French,
Yeah.
God, I'll spare the audience. The more things change, the more some of them are staying the same. OTAs, for example, other transaction authority notwithstanding, that hasn't changed the world.
No, I don't think that. And I think part of it, I thought maybe we were going to get to this a little bit later, but some of it is the acquisition system, and some of it, as Dave alluded to, is budget uncertainty.
Okay.
Right. So it's not always the fault of the acquisition
It's not a
system.
contracting issue.
Sometimes the contracting officers or program managers don't have their budgets. They don't know their budgets, and restrictions in the system limit them from letting a contract. And then they get their budgets, and then it takes a long time, to 6 months, a year to get a contract.
Or it's certainly hard to contract for an outcome or an output on a short basis. If there's just a short frame of time within which the contract performance is, you almost have to buy inputs or sell inputs.
Right. And that's the real challenge.
Tina, let me work with this metaphor again. Kind of, where's your barometer of tastes and preferences in among the customer for the kinds of changes Dave was alluding to?
Yeah, I think Dave is onto something about, one thing that we try to work with our clients, especially in the early phases of shaping an opportunity, is to try to understand what they're trying to do, right? Because there are times when an FTE, I need 10 people to do this thing, works depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to revamp, as an example, an energy system down at, CCAT or at Guantanamo Bay, that is not your answer, right? So what we've tried to do is focus them on outcomes. Like right now, what's hitting my head as we're having this conversation is I have a client where we are working like an agile software development almost, but it's really an implementation. So the way we contracted it for is, it's a software implementation. They bought the software, this will be easy. It can be your typical kind of implementation contract. But what we're finding is a services model might have helped them a little better because they weren't sure what they wanted, but they didn't know that.
Yeah.
So now we're finding ourselves, they keep changing things. There's a frustration and a tension that we want to be responsive, but we have to go by our contract. So, we're working our way through that. And thankfully it's a good client and we have got a great partnership. So we can have some pretty open conversations. So we're getting our way through it. But if we had looked at that as a deliverable product and put, metrics around it, we probably could have saved ourselves some heartache, right?
Or may I invoke the concept of as a service? Maybe this could have been bought as a service instead of as a piece of software, if that I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, and I think one of the changes we've seen is, or maybe I should say I've seen over in that course, is I felt like in my early career, it was more that the government often outsourced things through services that they didn't want to do or couldn't do, right? Like mow the grass or, keep the IT system running, right? There really wasn't this and this is my experience, I'm not sure it's true for all, but there wasn't this, I'm a true partner in you because I'm helping you achieve your strategy. Like the change I've kind of seen is that the government is now looking more for partnerships, right? Like, I don't know if you have a chance to listen to General Raymond of Space Force talk,
Okay,
but
yep.
when you speak with him, he really thinks he's got a unique opportunity to do some of the things Rob's describing on looking at the acquisition process, because he's setting up a new force for the first time in decades, right? And he's small, right? So he can be agile and he can try some things. So I do see people in the government trying to noodle through how are they able to contract more efficiently, but also get the products they want out of it. And they're starting to look at industry more as a partner, right? Which there's often sometimes this, well, that's them, the contractors, and that's us, the government, right? The most successful models I've seen is when we truly can work together as a partner. And I'm starting to see more of that. It might be, it's still in the early infancy, but I think if we as industry can really show the government that we're trying to be their partner and help solve their problem and their solution, we're going to make more headway that way. I think too, Dave mentioned in his comments, like that whole LPTA thing, right? Like not low price, technically acceptable. For those of you who don't know, that's often the government will put out an RFP and say their award criteria is the lowest priced, technically acceptable solution, right?
Cross the bar.
Cross the bar,
price.
which doesn't do anything for anybody, right? Because it incents us as contractors to race to the bottom on the price, right? And how do we do that, right? We try to cut overhead and stuff, but we often at the back of our people, right, with salaries and so forth. And then the government now, I may have something unique that they really want, but if Rob underpriced me by a couple dollars, they've got to go to him. Right. Even though I have a differentiator. So I think getting out of that LPTA mindset and looking more at, best value and allowing the government to really get the solution they're looking for. Obviously, there's got to be competition, and we've got to make sure that the prices are good and competitive, but not making it solely a price shootout. Now, luckily at Siemens, where I sit now in the technology market, we're seeing more best value, but I'm sure there's elements of the services market that is still seeing a lot of that LPTA type methodology, and that's difficult, I think, for everybody to succeed.
Let me pick up on this concept of partnership. The difficulty of partnership, whether with the government or with between two businesses, is risk sharing. That's kind of what the partner of the ship is about, is being able to share risk, but at the same time calibrate rewards in a manner that you think is fair. That's a subtle business. Government contracting doesn't tend to do well at subtlety. I wonder if either of you, maybe Rob, start there. Can you give me an example of where a partnership where you've had to share some risk has worked, and what the lesson of it was?
So we have seen some with risk sharing, but I'll back up a second. So one of the reasons why I say DTRA is our largest customer is they work very much.
Agency, just to remind the audience.
Defense Threat Reduction. They work very much in a partnership mode with their contractors, and they're almost in some ways unique in that there is, I would say, maybe a community of contractors that support them, but it's all advanced technology and development. It's not, they do contract for CETA services, but we stay on the performer side, and there's a group of contractors that stay on the performer side. And when they let a contract, it may be based on hours, but it's very much working with a program manager who relies on the contractor that can deliver for them and help them satisfy their mission, because they have customers they have to satisfy. It's not so much a risk sharing. I think on something like the respirators, it's risk sharing, because if we don't deliver, we're taking on some of the risk. We had there was sort of a shootout a couple of years ago that the Army did with an autonomous robotic vehicle, and they went out to industry, and it was very much outcome based, and we love those kind of programs. Okay, contractors, we want a robotic vehicle that can go from point A to point B with or without a driver, go through some obstacles, and we're going to have fund this in phases with down selects. For me, I think that's a great opportunity for us, and a great way for the government to do business. It gets away from LPTA. It gets the government what they want, and industry is fiercely competitive, and we will do whatever. Our folks are working nights and weekends to make that work. So we love those kind of procurements, and the Army's done more of that. We have some augmented reality software we're doing from for the Army, similar kind of things. So so in that case, yes, there's risk sharing. We had to invest to go to the shootouts to develop the end product.
Right.
Some cases, you talked about one thing I didn't say, like changes. Well, one thing we're seeing in our market is big changes in our customers want to buy open systems, right? I'm sure you're seeing that too, Tina. Modular systems, which is a big change from the past as far as complete proprietary systems. So all of our customers, if it's a piece of hardware, if it's a robot or it's a piece of software, they want it to be modular. They want other contractors to be able to put pieces and parts into it, because technology develops really fast. So they figured out that they need to have products, things that they can adapt really quickly.
So they want to buy your IP with the system.
Yes.
I assume that's always a contentious part of the negotiation.
It's always challenging. I would say,
or do they want to buy your?
No,
I
they
assume
do.
they're
No,
willing to
they do.
compensate
The
you for your
government
IP.
more and more wants the IP because they're, I think things go in cycles. I think right now we're in a cycle where the government wants the IP and the government wants to be the systems integrator. I would say that doesn't always work best, but we have augmented reality software that ARA developed that is a heads-up display for soldiers, so they can see where other members of their squad are, where they can get directions for from the commander. And we worked an agreement with the Army about 2 years ago to license that software. They have a fully paid up exclusive license to that software, but we have a services contract behind that to help the Army implement that in different pieces of hardware.
Yeah.
So it can kind of work both ways. And, that was a good model. We could have taken a different approach. No, this is our intellectual property. We're going to just sell you the product. But in the end, we realized this is good for everybody because the software is going to have to be continually advanced. We have a services contract to do that, and they're going to be able to give that to hardware manufacturers that can integrate it into their products. So long term, it'll work out fine for us.
Right. Well, these are the
So all kinds. There
these
are
are the
different
hard,
models.
subtle questions that CEOs get paid to figure out.
Yeah. Well, it was challenging. We had to decide what to do.
Right. Exactly. Let me move to the other side of the market, to the supply side. And Tina, you've indicated you're a finance person. You've done mergers and acquisitions. I certainly observe. I think it's not hard to observe a couple of broad trends over the last, I would mark it at about 5 years, that are changing the structure of the services industry, which I think it might be said started out 20 years ago with a lot of small companies, gravitated to some medium-sized companies. But the striking trend of the last 5 years for me is twofold, and they relate to one another. One is the big prime contractors exiting, not always and everywhere, but broadly exiting the services industry. Lockheed Martin has broadly exited the services industry. And a couple, 3 or 4 of the players, Leidos is most special, but its counterpart SAIC are gaining scale. And so there seems to be a restructuring where investors anyway think that scale and diversity is the winning formula. Discuss, starting with Tina.
Okay. No, that's an easy one, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I think, when I was inside of Lockheed Martin, you often saw the forces at play that you're describing, right? Because I was always in Lockheed Martin services. I was never part of what we called the platform company. I wasn't making the cool planes and all that stuff. But and Lockheed had separated the services business. But one of the conversations we always had internally was it's a different business model, right? Because the products team has infrastructure and it takes a lot of hangars and jets and all that stuff.
CapEx.
I can't pay for that, right? Then my margins might not be what it is on an R&D, for an airplane, but we are consistent. We're consistent, good, solid margin. There's always going to be a services need. So I think what you see companies are doing is they start to figure that out. And as a company starts to figure out what do they really want to be, it's kind of hard, not impossible, but hard to be both. Right. So
it's hard to run multiple business models.
It's hard
even in a big
company, right? And then it becomes distracting to, if whatever you decide your thing is going to be, the other becomes a distraction, right? So I think as I watched what's happening with the big, divesting their services, they're not so much divesting because it's not good business. It's just different than what their core is. Right. And then you see like the Leidoses and the SAICs being really successful, right? And private equity, very interested in that market.
Exactly.
Right. Because there's good money to be made there. Right. And to your comment about risk sharing, depending on the services you do, I mean, there's obviously risky services out there. I will tell you, building camps in Africa has its challenges, as example. But there are also other ones that have a lower risk profile. So you can build a very nice portfolio of varying risk profiles, which as an investor, if I'm a moderate investor, that is good for me, right? I'm going to look, if I'm a little more, a risk taker, then I can go to some of these more, these services that pay a little more, but there's a lot higher risk. So I think you can get a better differentiation in the market by having that separation. And I think that's what we're seeing happening now. You see it cycle, right? Like, Lockheed got rid of it all and then they bought some of it back and then they'll get rid of it all, right? So I also think the bigs use, what's nice about the services industry, if you are in a big platform company, is platforms do this. Right. I remember very clearly, I was at Lockheed before the Joint Strike Fighter program was awarded. Right. And if you looked at all of their top financials, we had, here's our current platforms and they're all doing this, right? Because the Strike Fighter hadn't been awarded. So you need something to fill it up, right? And we were the rock stars then, right? Because we were at the same time, what was happening in the IT services is LMIT was going gangbusters, right? We had, we were buying companies and we were growing. So it was nice for them to use the services industry to help modulate some of the
that was exactly the theory by which they came to have services.
Right, exactly. So I think what you see is just, depending on what's happening in the cycle of the market that we're in, you're going to see this. And I think the private equity ownership is an interesting element to the market too, because if done well, if a private equity company buys and can invest to help better the company, it can be a very good thing for a company. What you have to watch out is there's companies out there who obviously are just in it for the 4-year window and out quick, highly leverage them and run. That's a challenge. That's a challenge to run as a CEO. Where there's some really good companies, private equity companies who understand that the investment in a services company will pay the good dividends for their clients.
If you build it rather than
if you build it
disinvest
and don't over leverage it so that you're paralyzed by the debt payments.
So Rob, how if you accept and you don't have to, my inference that scale, that there's some greater at least promise of return to scale. How does that feel as a small company? Do those big balance sheets worry you, particularly with a customer that maybe not dramatically, but incrementally is beginning to ask for more risk sharing, where having a bigger balance sheet might count for something?
So I'd have to say no.
Good.
I don't think that's ever been an issue for us or a consideration. We compete against the companies that you mentioned. We don't compete against Siemens. But the services companies that you mentioned, and we're successful. I don't want to get anybody upset, but we're successful all the time. And the other part of it is, so ARA, I don't think I mentioned, ARA is 100% owned by our employee retirement plan.
Interesting.
And as part
another acronym, ESOP.
ESOP. So we're an ESOP, and so the risk part of the equation is, what are our shareholders willing to risk, right? So we have to think about that. Not just me, our other senior managers, our board. We have to think about that when we make investments.
Sure.
And for us, if we have to make a couple $1 million bet, that's a big deal for us. So we measure the risk, but the good thing about being an ESOP, we don't have outside shareholders. We have no debt, effectively no debt. We've accumulated a lot of cash because we have tax advantages. So we do have money to invest. And so we are looking for more of those risk sharing opportunities. We actually like them, although that's not our core business model. Mostly, we're still 60 or 65% cost reimbursable contracts. We're taking on more fixed price contracts where, of course, there's risk. So, but we are looking for opportunities to share risk, and we've done that. In fact, with the respirators, BARDA took it to a certain level, and they have other things that we're continuing to do for them. But we've invested pretty significantly our own capital to stand up some additional manufacturing and work here and go through the testing process. So those are kind of things that we do, and we're looking for opportunities to do that.
Well, I mean,
we can't invest $50 million, right? But if we can risk share to a couple of $1 million, that's certainly within our wheelhouse of things that we do.
Well, I certainly think the industry, this sector of the industry would be healthier with the diversity of small companies and
Absolutely.
big companies. The current trend line does simply draw into question whether or not the little companies can carry on.
Well, I would say that, so let me personalize it. The
Yeah.
challenge is for the mid-sized companies like us,
Yes,
right?
excuse
Yeah.
me. Yeah, that's
So-
right. I
Yeah.
misspoke. You're a mid-sized company, not a
Because,
small company.
well, we consider ourselves a mid-size and everybody's got their own definition.
I think that's the better
but
characterization.
the big challenge for us, of course, is there are preferences for small businesses,
Right.
and the big companies have scale.
Yeah.
There's not much for the mid, and I'm not advocating for preferences
Right.
for mid-tier companies. I'm just saying that's the challenge
Yeah.
for us, for mid-sized companies, and I think to the detriment of the government and the customers we serve, because mid-sized companies have some scale where we can do risk sharing, we can invest internally and come up with solutions, the advanced technology solutions that our customers need. But it's challenging because of, we're squashed between the big
Yeah,
companies that have the
yeah,
scale
yeah.
and small business preferences. So
Right.
it's a challenge.
Mhm.
All right, let me remind the audience that in 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less, we'll take questions from the audience. Byron Callan, I hope, has got some good ones already queued up. But if you have not taken the time and you have a question in your mind, please type it out in the Q&A tab of your Zoom program, and Byron will curate them and offer us some questions after this last section of our discussion. Drivers of change. We're already talking about several of them, but let's start with people. Let's go back to a topic that came up early in the conversation, and for that matter, in your own biographies, of what motivates people. How do you attract people? Let's just start, Tino, with how's the human capital dimension of your resource base, and where I want to particularly learn is it changing, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think I think Dave was spot on in his opening comments around it's always a challenge, right, to find the people. I never feel like, oh, I'm flush with a ton of people. There's always an opportunity that we're looking for people, and I think one of the hardest skill sets for us to fill right now is really because of something Rob mentioned earlier, is technology changes so quickly that trying to find the individuals on the digital side who can keep up, no longer are we, you go to school, you get a degree, you come out, you start work, and then you're done learning, right? It doesn't work, right? And that even you can maybe do that for a couple of years before, you can't do that for 10 minutes now, right? Because you need that workforce that's consistently learning, and those people are in high demand, right? So you think around, our digital engineering team is very difficult to keep staffed. Our cybersecurity team, right? Those people are incredibly important in what we do. And those technology skills, we talk a lot about inside of Siemens, how do we help them make that, how do we help our workforce grow with the digital transformation, right? We think about, oh, we're transforming things, but you're really going to have to transform people, right? Because and I think as you go through that transformation, we don't have to leave people behind. What we have to think about is how do we bring them along so that they can learn and get the skills that we need. Because if you leave everybody behind, where else are you going to get the people from, right? You need to bring them along. So partnering with universities, we have internship programs, we have apprenticeship programs where we really try to train the people up to try to keep them, moving in the right technology direction. But I'll be honest, it's hard because it's changing so fast that you can't. It's really difficult to keep up.
Is the larger company, Siemens, is that some kind of a resource for your human capital problem? I wouldn't be surprised if Siemens has its own software school.
They absolutely right. They have a lot of different training programs, and that's why I think I sit in almost a catbird seat, right? Because I get to be a mid-tier company, but I am powered by this incredibly technological powerhouse that has all these great resources. But if you listen to Roland Bush, our CEO, or Barb Humpton, our CEO here in the U.S., they will often talk about this human capital problem. Like we've really done, and I think the pandemic has changed how we have to think about our workforce, right? I was very proud to be part of Siemens a few months ago when Roland came out and said, we're going to permanently make some of these changes around mobile working, right? Because we largely pivoted to a work from home workforce because we had to, and we did okay.
Yeah.
Right. Not that there's not, I think there's a lot of, none of us want to be locked home all day long, right? And there's a lot of mental health issues we have to worry about for that. But as we come out of this, giving the people the flexibility to be able to work at home a couple of days, and because there's some good things, right? I don't know about you, but I'm working out a whole lot more, right? Because I'm not sitting in my car 2 hours a day, right? So,
Sure.
so if I could still have that piece of this new work-life balance, that would be great.
Right.
So I think what we're trying to think about as workforce initiatives is how do we meet people where they are? I think the other good thing about, and I hate to say anything good about the pandemic because there isn't anything good, but
Right.
one outcome that is favorable, maybe is a way to
Yes,
say
there
it, is that now that I don't have to move people here to Washington, D.C. necessarily to do
Mhm.
work. I've got this remote workforce. I can hire like the best digital engineer. And if he's in or she is in Wichita, Kansas, cool.
Yeah.
I can do that now.
Right.
Right. So I think it's opened the aperture that we all kind of knew, I think, that we could work remotely like this, but we never really had the proof point. And this thing pushed us hard, right? And quickly.
Right.
So I think that will help companies as we look to hire diverse, workforces, because now we can tap anywhere in the world, right? And I've got engineers over in Europe. I
Right.
used to have to put people over in Europe to help them solve their problems. I don't have to do that anymore, right? So
Mhm.
I think it helps us ease our workforce problem, but we still got to stay on top of the technology skill set to make sure that we offer the people the skills and the training that we're going to need to take us into the next revolution
Yep.
of technology.
In your company, Rob, is the human capital equation, the more things change, the more they stay the same, or is something more decisively changing in managing human capital?
Almost the same answer. I mean, we have a challenge finding talented people. We have internal training, but it's difficult. A part of it is our customers are demanding, right? So we're in advanced technology. Everything we're doing is working on advanced technology programs for our customers. And our customers expect us to provide trained experts all the time. So that's a bit of a challenge for us, I think. But I think that's always been the case for us. So, I don't know. It's when we're busy, it's always difficult to find the people that, Dave mentioned it, Tina
Mhm.
talked about it. It is a little bit easier with people working in where they want to work in geographically dispersed areas. So, I don't know. Just
Has turnover been any different? And I don't even mean to mark this necessarily by the pandemic, which probably is a confounding factor unto itself, but like in the last 5 years, more, less, are people looking for stability?
our turnover is pretty low, and it's
Mhm.
historically
And
been
hasn't
pretty
changed
low.
much.
And I think actually during the pandemic, it went down a little bit.
Yeah.
I think people were less mobile.
Right.
So, I don't think it's. I think we've seen it come up a little bit in the last couple of months. So we watch that.
So again, depending on where the audience, any individual member of the audience is observing the services industry, they may not be that surprised by the frequency of the word technology and software in this conversation. Others might be quite surprised to realize that yours are really digital 21st century businesses, both of yours most especially. In the last Captains of Industry event that I ran a couple months ago, it featured the CEO of Anduril Technologies, Brian Shimp, and of Maxar, Dan Jablonski. And although neither of them said these words, I left that event with the echo in my mind of, to coin the phrase, software will eat the world, even the defense market. Software may eat the defense market. Discuss, react. Will software eat the defense market, and can SGT be one of those eaters?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we kind of already are, right? And I said, the power of the technology, that the software that, like just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Roper, who was the head of acquisition for the Air Force, put out a letter standardizing, to your point about open architectures and being able to plug in. He quickly realized we've got to figure out how we're going to all do this together. And he went out and said that, Siemens Team Center is going to be his product of choice. And if you're going to use anything but Team Center in the Air Force, you need to get an exception.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to tell us what Team Center is.
Team Center is our PLM solution. So it's
PLM,
allowed.
slower, please.
Oh goodness, product
lifecycle management.
Yeah, thank you.
Product lifecycle
Product
management.
lifecycle management. Caught me off guard with the acronyms. We were joking about that prior to starting, guys. But it essentially lets all the different machines and the processes talk to each other, right? And we talk about inside of SGT the digital thread for defense. So that's why when I think about, are we an eater? Yeah. And what we talk about is you can use software to help everything from the acquisition process we talked about from the beginning, where you talk about here are requirements. Because if you think about the thread as you go through a procurement, right? The government develops requirements, we in industry help, right? Then they kick over an RFP, and then it becomes a very industry heavy activity.
Right.
And they kick it back to them, they award. So through that whole thread, technology and software can really help enable that, right? Because you could, if you have a platform that would really allow you to interact equally at each one of those stages, and then take the data that you gather through that product, that when you deliver, and now I can build that into my next.
You don't have to wonder, what did that cost
I don't
when
have
we
to remember what
developed it
that
in
cost.
2014?
Right. So our whole play to that space is make our software as open as we can so that people can interact with it. Because as you go through that thread, it's not going to help if the softwares can't talk to each other throughout the process, right? So I really do think software is going to change. And I think the government is now realizing that, right? I think we get, I was telling you earlier, we get pulled in by our clients. Hey, Tina, this is really cool. Can you come over and talk to this part of my, my group that is looking to solve that problem? So like right now, it's
like
feels
knock-ons from PSYOP.
Yeah, like knockoff from PSYOPs, right? Like the Marines want to talk about it, the Army wants to talk about it, the Navy's actually encouraging us to go show them what this digital software can do. So I think there's this almost awakening that's happening, and the power of what software can do for them. Now the question becomes, they need to learn how to contract for it, right? To your point, is software as a service, and we've got to figure out some of that with them, because how do you do that when you're actually doing deliverable products, right? But I think to me, it's a very exciting opportunity, an exciting conversation that's starting to happen, because my mind goes to what the art of the possible is if we can actually make this happen, right? How do we, having lived in the acquisition cycle for the last 20 some odd years, I know how hard it is. If you can start to streamline that and use the software that we can all, industry and government, share, this is going to be so much more fun.
Given your biography and the several things you've said about ARA, I wouldn't be surprised if AI, artificial intelligence, was something you were doing 20 years ago. So what's the place of, am I wrong? Am I wrong?
That's amazing. I didn't tell you that, Steve. But actually, when I started working for ARA back in Raleigh in the late 80s, early 90s, I said, okay, AI, they called them expert systems at the time, and AI, this is going to be the next big deal. And I took some classes in it, actually. So, but it's been a long time coming, right, in this industry. So we do quite a bit of it now. You talk about the whole interesting thing with software. When ARA started, we were a bunch of engineers doing calculations on calculators and slide rules and coding the computers. And today, we probably a large part of
floppy disks.
Well, a large part of our workforce today are software developers, right? Because everything you said, software is going to eat the world. Everything we do has a software development component to it to make things work. So AI, great examples. We're working on autonomous robotics. How do you make a robot that can go from some point behind the battle lines to travel 5 miles in uncharted territory with no maps, go to the battlefield, pick up a wounded soldier, bring the soldier back to the field hospital.
Right.
There are lots of advances in the hardware technology, drive-by-wire vehicles, electronics that goes into the vehicles, but the heart is the software brain, right? The engine, the control systems that do all of that. So, so software really does all of that, and that's an AI application. We're also doing a lot of machine learning applications now related to automated image processing, right? So a robot needs to be able to sense the environment and understand the environment. Intel analysts need to take satellite photos, figure out, okay, there's a building there, but what's that building made of? What's potentially going on inside of it? Those are all AI machine learning applications that we're working on. But I don't, so yes, for us at ARA, our strategy has always been to broaden and deepen our technologies. And because we work for research agencies and we work for program offices that dream up, what's the next cool thing that I need to do to support the warfighter, we have to constantly stay up with our technology and always looking for the subject matter experts to bring in the new people.
Right.
And then train our people. And exactly what Tina said, you have to bring people along, right? Because you can't find, we call them, I know in the private equity space, they call companies unicorns. We call those people unicorns, right? You can't, a lot of times our guys are looking for this person with 25 years of experience and all these advanced technologies. And then you just sit back and realize, oh, that's a unicorn. That person does, I talk to our folks, that person doesn't exist, right? So quit wasting time looking for that person. You're not going to find that person. So we do have to do internal training and bring our people along. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. We could go on, but we need to take some questions. I hope Byron Callan is at the ready. Byron, offer us up a question or two from the audience, or three at least, that we might fit in before the top of the hour.
I am ready, Steve. I assume you can hear me loud and clear.
We do. Perfect.
Okay,
Lay it on us.
Okay. The first question is from Barry Pavel, who's the director of the Scowcroft Center. He asks, where do you see the government service sector heading in the next 5 to 10-year time frame? So that's maybe a little bit longer look, particularly when more advanced technology will be in the force. In other words, AI, C4ISR, swarming drones.
Okay. Let me suggest the following so we can get a lot of questions. I'll just pitch each of the questions to one of you and we'll go to the next question.
Okay.
What's at least a something we haven't yet talked about in the trend line of the services industry, just to pick up on Barry's question.
Yeah,
Thanks, Barry.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I think the it's such a hard question, right? Because you wish I had a crystal ball, right? But I think the one thing history is
you have a lifeline in Rob.
Yeah,
if you
I know.
need it.
Yeah. I may tag you in. No, but I think what history has told us is, you always want to try, like the way I think about it in the services industry is we have to help the customer be ready for the next fight. What's the most logical next fight, right?
Okay, right.
Right. So the most logical next fight, I think, is going to be some kind of cyber warfare, right? Is going to be some kind of potentially space warfare where we're, I think when you listen to the Space Force General Raymond talk, he's like, we need to think about that as what if someone's, what if that becomes a theater, right? So if you can kind of think about from a client perspective, where are they trying to prepare for? Then you look at your individual capabilities and how can you then help? I think you're going to see a lot more services in that that higher end. I mean, it's hard because we already talked a lot about this, but higher end technologies, right? They're gonna use the services market to solve some of those higher end kind of harder IT cyber type questions than they maybe historically have done in the past.
Moving beyond blast calculations.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
What else? What's another question, Byron? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to conjoin two questions, actually, from Marjorie Sensor at Inside Defense and then Frank Finelli at Carlisle. And I guess it's really a question about what policies, or are there policies specific to services contracting that you would like to see from the new administration? And how do small business policies under the DoD fit into that? Are there more effective strategies that the new administration should be pursuing?
Okay. Rob, you're right up against, just as you yourself characterize yourself in that barbell between small companies and big companies.
And that's a super loaded question that probably my answer won't make anybody happy, right? So
then you'll know it's about
the right answer.
So, with policy, what we really need is less regulation, more the kind of things David said, more outcome-based, less focus on, racing to the bottom with LPTA, what each hour of person cost. I don't know. I don't have great optimism after doing, that a lot of those things are going to change, but really, I think for us, what would help ARA would be changes to the acquisition system in services. So much of the acquisition system is focused on products. Dave alluded to this earlier, and so much of what has been designed to make sure that we don't have a mess up in a product, right? Buying an F-35 or buying a submarine or buying an aircraft carrier, and that gets applied to services. So the regulations are very complex. It slows down procurement. I would kind of like to see the government, if I had to make a suggestion, maybe two things. I'll just say one. I would like to see the government look at sort of like mid-sized contracts where they want to do technology development and kind of use an OTA type structure, but codify that in the FAR so that contracting officers will use that. there's a lot of goodness in OTAs that can make things go fast,
Right.
but we need to get contracting officers to adopt those. So I would say, look at how we do OTAs. What is it that we can do to bring that into acquiring technology development, services, things that can get things into the platforms more quickly and to the battlefield more quickly, and bring that into the FAR-based contracting, so people will use them more widely.
Neither 15 nor 12, something that works between them. Got it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay,
so-
Byron. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Frank. Byron?
Question from Mark Massa of Atlanta Council. How are increasing concerns about the supply chain security impacting the professional services sector? Are any of these impacts unique compared to other defense contractors?
Okay, PLM must have taken
I'll take
on
this one. Yeah, I can
security.
start with this one. Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah. So actually, and I'm surprised it hadn't come up. I was just sitting here thinking, I'm surprised
That's
this
why
hasn't
we
come up
rely on the
earlier.
audience.
Good God, good question. Yeah, supply chain security, right? Wow. You think about if there's one thing the pandemic showed us, that, right, is how
Right.
quickly and important that is. I will tell you that there's plenty of activity going on around how do we, two things: keep the supply chain secure, and reshore or domesticate those pieces that are critical to us.
Mhm.
I think, the interesting thing is when you talk to the government about it, they all knew that this was a problem. And like we have a lot to offer in this area. And when I first started trying to explore where do I go, this was your typical example of a lot of chefs in the kitchen, but nobody really in charge, right? So there's, one thing I would recommend to the new administration is to really, and they are, I mean, we just did a paper, SGT worked on a paper with PTP on supply chain security.
Mhm.
And some of the recommendations we make is, you've got to get a concerted effort around how are you going to tackle this beast, right? And look at it from a soup to nuts kind of issue, from the services people, to the question that's been asked. The services industry has a lot to offer, but what we have to first figure out is where are they trying to go with the supply chain security
Mhm.
piece of it, and figuring out how we help. And it's such a hard problem when you think about it, because like we met with OSD a couple weeks ago, and think about like microchips as an example, right?
Sure.
The supply chain for microelectronics is an interesting problem, right? Because I've got a fully deployed, all these platforms fully deployed.
Right.
How do I know that those are secure, and what's in those today? And more importantly, going forward, how do I assume, how do I figure out what the path forward is to make sure our supply chain is secure? You got options, right? Do I try to bring everything in like guards
Right.
and guns, right, and produce everything in really high security? Yeah, I could probably do that for a few things, but that's not your
And for money.
and for money, for a lot of money, right? So maybe for the most critical of things, I do that. But the
Mhm.
reality becomes is, how do I deploy that then into the platform? So I
Right.
think, the services industry can be a real partner in figuring this out. And I think what you're seeing from an industry perspective is we're all kind of noodling around this too, and we're helping each other through that. So I think you're going to see a lot more activity on this
Right.
quickly, because we can't not this problem not be solved going forward.
But this is certainly within the scope of many of the services and companies to help.
Absolutely.
to
Yeah,
help,
absolutely.
Particularly those that have, I think of the commercial aerospace industry. There's not a component on a commercial
Right.
jet that today,
Mhm.
Boeing or Airbus couldn't tell me exactly the provenance of exactly that component. That's
Right.
part of the regulatory standard that they've built to before. So we've got some models from which to work.
Right. And I think what you got to think about is like one of the things, like we at Siemens, we do this for the food industry as an example.
Okay.
Right? Like I can tell you, for
Right.
coffee beans, a great example, right? I can tell you for where coffee bean was grown, who harvested
Yeah.
it, where right? So why can't I do that for microelectronics? I can, but we just never have.
Yep.
Right. So the question is, you've got all these technologies inside of our companies that we can easily do that, because we do it for
Right.
food security.
This is what I'm
Right.
hoping.
Yeah, we do
and
it for
surmising.
food security. So now we just have to figure out, and we got to get serious about it, right? Which I think now we all are, given what we've just been through for the last, year and a half.
And forgive me for reiterating, except I think it's too often forgot, the customer's got to be willing to pay for it. 'Cause it is
Absolutely.
going to cost
Mm.
something.
Absolutely.
Particularly the
Absolutely.
onshoring idea, which I have some ambivalence about.
Yeah.
Byron, that was a good one. What else you got? Even if it's one of your own questions, Byron, I wouldn't sideline your voice in this if you were thinking you should.
Well, I will remind people to submit questions to the Q&A function. If you can identify yourself, that'd be terrific. But while we're waiting for another question or two, Tina, you sit in kind of a unique position because I guess at Siemens, you also get a good look at what other governments may be doing with their services contracts. I just wonder if there are any lessons or things that you think are really kind of best practices from a Siemens global perspective. And then Rob, if I may, can you talk a little bit about kind of ingesting new technology? How quickly do you partner with universities? You know, what do you do to kind of stay on top of this tsunami of change that seems to be coming?
Okay, great. Let's take each of those questions in turn, and
Okay.
that will probably put a wrap on our discussion. So we'll start with the first one that he asked of Tina.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So thank you for that. I think the thing I learned from watching my Siemens counterparts in, bigger Siemens is this idea of, is this idea of partnership, right? Other governments, when I see Siemens interact with other governments, their most successful contracts are ones where, the CEO of Siemens and the head of state or whoever the person on the government side are truly partnering together for whatever that solution is, right? And I feel like here it becomes a little bit of us them, right? It's like there's the contractors and then there's government, where I love when you see somebody from industry go into government. I love when you see somebody from government to come back into industry, because we learn so much from each other when we do that, right? Because it's such a unique, we've really got this procurement system is unique, right?
Right.
And I actually had, I guess it was about, it must've been a year and a half ago, because it was before the pandemic. I got to spend some time speaking to some allied leaders of our allied forces that had come over as part of the Army program and training and developing, and
Yep.
got to talk to them about how they do things, right?
Mhm.
And like, it's so interesting because you try to get up there, you try to explain, hey, this is how it works in the US. And they're looking at us like, oh, we want to model what you all do. And in my head, I'm thinking,
Not so
maybe
fast.
not all of it, but when you see that the speed at which they're able to work together. And again, it gets to the partnership. Like they're not as worried about, oh, well, if I step out of 12 part, 7 part 2, right?
Right.
That I've got a problem. So I think if we can learn, and we talk about this, I talk about this with my counterparts in Siemens, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you get that? And what they reemphasize to me is you got to be the customer's partner. Like Roland has said, like, we have to not fall in love with our solutions.
Yeah.
We have to fall in love with our customers' problems.
Right.
And when we do that, everything else becomes easier, right? So put yourself in your customer's shoes and then figure it out. Right. And that's, I think we can with in our industries and what we do, especially in the services industry, because we've got such flexibility. Like,
Yeah.
I don't need to build a warehouse every time I want to do a service. Right. If we can really just try to put ourselves in their shoes and just figure it out. Right. And I think our government leaders are willing to do that.
Well, that's why I hearken to the concept of risk when we talk about partnerships, because I would like to think that one of the ways to get the customers more comfortable being partners is by somehow showing them the risk, getting them to recognize the risk that you're willing to take on to solve your problem, and hope that become a way of facilitating real partnership where they can value that. They hopefully value that you're going to take some risk. And that's our contribution to the partnership.
Yeah, and I think even explaining that to them, like in this supply chain conversation we're having, right? One of the things they want to do is they want to take my software code, right? And they want to take it and they want to put it somewhere, and they want me not to be able to see it anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, but they didn't understand. Like, I was in a conversation with them and they're like, well, why is that a big deal? I promise I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm like, ugh, like, you don't understand, right?
Right.
So I think it's incumbent on us for them. Like, I was taking this huge risk that they didn't even understand I was taking.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's not even so much just about money and dollars and what I put in, but it's, the what I contribute. I'm happy to contribute, but you need to understand what a big deal that is for me, and how are you going to protect me against that? So I think those conversations have to be held as if we're going to get there together. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. We've built an agenda for Dave Berteau.
There you go, Dave.
as if he didn't already have it.
I think he's working that already.
Technology ingestion, Rob, just a couple minutes and then we'll have to.
Real quick. So that's the life of ARA. If we're not staying up with the latest technologies, a company like ARA dies, and our customers demand that. So what we do is we're continually looking at technologies that are emerging. We look at all the modernization priorities that come out of OSD, the R&E office. And so we systematically, we continually go through those. And if we do an introspection. If we have a gap in key technology areas, then we'll start programs to start searching for, we call them strategic hires. So we look to fill gaps, and it couldn't be a small acquisition. We've done a few small acquisitions in the last 5 years as well to fill those gaps. So we're constantly looking at that to stay fresh. And Byron mentioned universities. So we have university partnerships. Sometimes we team with universities when we're working on projects for the research agencies. IARPA, the Intelligence ARPA agency, is a big one for us. They like us to team with universities. We do that a lot. And we actually have some internal programs now where we're looking to really build our partnerships with universities. We haven't really thought about it, I would say, somewhat from the recruiting perspective, but actually just as partners to solve problems for our customers, because our customers demand that, right? If we can't leverage the latest technologies in artificial intelligence or robotics or computational fluid dynamics for hypersonic problems, if we can't be doing that, they'll go someplace else.
Yep.
So we work closely. We're doing that more from a project perspective with universities.
All right.
Much more.
Well, we are going to have to draw this conversation to an end, this really terrific conversation to an end. I do think it has met my expectations and the expectations I'd set with our audience. They learned more about what I had found, and I think maybe the audience would have found to be surprising and terrifically interesting things about the government services sector, and the difficult challenges in the operation of the market, and some of those forward-looking trends of people and technology that are going to continue to change this sector of the industry over time. So before we close, let me offer some gratitudes, not least to Tina and Rob and your companies for being featured here. I appreciate it very, very much. It's been a great, rich conversation. Not least to Dave Berteau, the oft mentioned, it turns out. Dave Berteau, maybe no surprise there, but also my friend Byron Callan. Thanks, Byron, for curating questions for us. Maybe most especially, I want to take a minute and acknowledge, as you can see, we are here COVID compliant by the Atlantic Council's and the City of Washington's rules, and really pleased to have done this. Hopefully those of you in the audience see this as yet another glimmer into the future, the end of this dark tunnel of the pandemic. And maybe the next time we meet in this setting, there will be some people right there sitting in front of us, which I know all of us would appreciate. Having said that, this was no ordinary task, and there are staff of both the Atlantic Council as well as these two companies that I want to call out for special thanks. They include here at the Atlantic Council, Christian Truddy, Julia Siegel, and Laura Macedo from our event staff, who've done some extra effort to make us safe and yet able to do this for you, broadcast this live in person. I appreciate Will Goodman's help from ARA, Rob, and Greg Bowman's help from SGT. Tina, thanks to both Greg and Will for helping me conceive and motivate this event. Let me mention, I've alluded to Forward Defense. The next great event, at least one of the next great events that I've got on my calendar that Forward Defense is sponsoring is part of its Commanders series. Mark your calendars for the 10th of May for a conversation with both the Acting Secretary of the Army, John Whitley, and its Chief of Staff, General James McConville. They will both be at the Atlantic Council for a Commander Series event on the 10th of May. I would expect invitations and announcements for that event will be out in a couple of weeks. Not least, thank you to the audience. Thanks for giving us your attention. I would encourage all of you who, if you found this conversation useful, please to share the experience with your friends and colleagues. A recording of this event will be available at the Atlantic Council's website at the very same link that you used to register for it. And we hope others who did not have the time this morning but would be interested will avail themselves of the opportunity to watch the recording over the next several weeks and maybe months. Those things go on for a long time in my experience. Okay, this was a great Captains of Industry event. I'm really grateful to the both of you for being here. Thank you very much.